Every single Brown child who was pulled away from Kody had a moment. A specific, documentable, undeniable moment where something broke. Paedon had his. Leon had theirs. Aspen had hers. These were painful, real, on-camera ruptures. Conversations that crossed a line. Words that couldn't be taken back. Silences that hardened into walls. These were moments you could point to on a timeline and say, that is where it ended. Truly Brown had none of that. She didn't have a breaking point. She didn't have a confrontation. She didn't have a goodbye. She had something far worse. A father who disappeared so slowly, so quietly, so completely without drama that there was nothing specific left to grieve. If that sentence just hit you somewhere you weren't expecting, you are exactly who this video is for. If this is your first time here, welcome to SisterWives Crew. Hit that like button right now and subscribe before we go any further. Because what we are about to walk through is the most important and most overlooked story in the entire SisterWives universe. And I promise you, by the time this video ends, you will never look at the Brown family dynamic the same way again. Let's go! Here's what most people miss when they talk about the Brown children and their fractured relationships with Kody. They focus on the ones who spoke up, and understandably so, Paedon gave interviews. Leon made their position publicly known. There were receipts, there were sound bites, there were moments the fandom could clip and analyze and debate. Those stories had texture and heat, and something to push back against. Truly's story has none of that. And that absence of drama is not evidence of a healthy relationship. It is evidence of something much harder to see. A child who was too young to articulate what was happening to her, in a family too consumed by its own collapse to slow down long enough to notice. Let me give you the sibling context first, because it matters enormously. Truly Brown is the youngest of Christine's 6 children. That sounds like a simple biographical fact. It is actually the most important sentence in this entire story, because what it means is this. Every one of her older siblings had years of a more present Kody before things started unraveling. Aspen remembers a father who showed up. Mykelti remembers a father who was involved. Paedon, even with all the complexity of his relationship with Kody, remembers a version of his father that he lost. He had something real to compare the absence against. Truly Brown does not have that archive. Her memories of Kody as a consistently present, emotionally engaged father are not buried under layers of disappointment and pain. They are simply thin, sparse. There is not much there to dig through because not much was ever deposited. She didn't lose a present father. She grew up in the gradual withdrawal of one. And that is a different kind of wound entirely. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't create scenes that end up on television. It just quietly shapes who you become. Now, I want to bring in something that the SisterWives narrative almost never addresses directly, and I think it's time someone did. There is a significant body of research on what happens to the youngest child in a family that fractures, and the findings are not comfortable. The youngest child, the one with the least context, the least cognitive framework for understanding adult decisions, the least ability to say, "This is not about me," is statistically the most likely to internalize a departing parent's absence as something personal. Not consciously, not in a way that shows up easily in conversation, but somewhere deeper than that, in the body, in the nighttime thoughts, on the way they scan a room when they walk into a school event and their father is not there. The youngest child asks the same question every time, in 1,000 different ways that don't use words. Was it me? Did I do something? Was I not enough to make him stay? Truly Brown was 9 years old when her family began its most visible collapse. 9 years old. She was in the highest risk category for exactly this kind of internalized paternal abandonment wound. And here's what makes that fact unbearable. Nobody in the Brown family's public story has ever addressed it. Not once. Not in a confessional, not in a sit-down, not in a moment where someone looked at the camera and said, "We need to talk about what Truly is carrying right now, because she is too young to carry it alone." The cameras kept rolling, and Truly kept growing up. Which brings me to something I need you to sit with for a moment, because it is the part of this story that gets lost in all the noise about the adult drama. Kody Brown processed his relationships publicly. That is the entire premise of the show, that the interior life of this family would be made visible, documented, archived. And he did process things publicly. He processed his deteriorating connection with Mary across multiple seasons. He processed Janelle's departure. He spent 2 full seasons processing Christine leaving, his grief, his confusion, his version of events. Those confessionals exist. You can go watch them right now. Kody's feelings about the end of those relationships are part of the public record. His feelings about what his withdrawal meant specifically for Truly Brown the child, most recently in her primary attachment years, the child with the least developmental capacity to make sense of his absence, are not part of the public record. There is no confessional where Kody sits down and says, "I know Truly is paying a cost for the choices I have made, and I owe her more than she is getting from me right now." That moment does not exist on tape. And on this show, on a show built on the premise that everything important gets said on camera, the absence of a moment is as meaningful as the moment itself. She was not grieved publicly. She was not named specifically. She was not the subject of a single extended conversation about what she needed and whether she was getting it. The silence is the data. Now let's talk about geography, because I think people underestimate how much the physical distance in this story functions as a kind of confession. When Christine made the decision to leave Flagstaff and relocate to Utah, Truly went with her. That is not a complicated fact. Truly was a child, Christine was her primary parent, Truly went where Christine went. But what happened next is where the story gets important. The distance between Flagstaff, Arizona and Salt Lake City, Utah is approximately 600 miles. That is roughly a 9-hour drive or a 2-hour flight. It is crossable. It is crossable by a parent who has made the decision that their child's access to them is non-negotiable, that the logistical inconvenience of distance is simply a problem to be solved, rather than a reason to slowly disappear. Other fathers in comparable situations rearrange their lives. They book the flights. They drive for hours. They restructure their schedules around the fixed point of their child's need for them. The public record of Kody Brown doing this consistently, specifically for Truly, in the period following Christine's relocation does not exist. Not because it definitely didn't happen, but because if it had happened at the frequency a 9-year-old girl needed it to happen, someone would have talked about it. On a show that documented everything that is a meaningful absence. 600 miles. He has the means to cross it. The documentation of him crossing it repeatedly with urgency because Truly needed him to is not there. And here is where I need to shift this story from past tense to present tense, because this is the pivot that most people miss entirely. Everything I have described so far, the sparse early memories, the undocumented withdrawal, the geographic separation, the public silence, people hear all of that and they frame it as history, as something that already happened and is now fixed and cannot be changed. And that framing is understandable. But it is also wrong, because Truly Brown is 13 years old right now. 13! Which means she is not on the other side of her childhood. She is inside it. She is in the middle of it. And attachment research on father-daughter relationships, specifically on the quality and consistency of a father's presence during a daughter's development, identifies the window between approximately ages 7 and 14 as the single most predictive period for a daughter's long-term relationship security, her self-worth architecture, and her capacity to set healthy boundaries with future partners. Truly Brown is at the precise midpoint of that window right now. The decisions being made today are not in 2019, when Christine first started pulling away, not in 2021 during the most documented crisis points of the show, but right now, in this calendar year, in whatever ordinary Tuesday afternoon is happening in Truly Brown's life as you watch this video. Those decisions are not historical. They are happening in real time. They are forming the relational template that Truly will carry into every significant relationship she has for the rest of her life. This is not a story about the past. This is a story about what is being written right now, in the quiet, undocumented space between a father and a daughter who are 600 miles apart, and getting further in ways that have nothing to do with geography. The cruelest abandonments are never dramatic. They are not built from single scenes that can be clipped and analyzed and argued about in comment sections. They are built from ordinary things, from Tuesday afternoons where a dad is somewhere else, from phone calls that go to voicemail, from school events where one seat in the audience is empty, from holidays that come and go and the child gets very good at not looking for a face that has stopped showing up. The undramatic nature of this particular absence is precisely what makes it so impossible to prosecute and so difficult to heal, because there is no single moment to point to, no clear line that was crossed, no obvious wound to dress. There are only thousands of ordinary moments that were supposed to be unremarkable and became remarkable only in their compounding, consistent, relentless absence. Truly Brown's loss is made of those moments. And nobody, not the show, not the family's public processing of its own collapse, not the extensive confessionals Kody gave about relationships with adults who had the language and the developmental capacity to advocate for themselves, nobody has named that loss directly. Nobody has sat down and said, this child is in a critical window. This father is not showing up for it, and that gap between what she needs and what she is receiving is not a private family matter. It is a child welfare question. We are saying it now. Stay with me, because what comes next is the part of this story that the fandom has been circling for years without quite being able to name. And I think it's finally time to name it directly. The second part is starting now. There is a specific kind of betrayal that is harder to name than the loud ones. Harder to prosecute. Harder to heal. It is not the betrayal of a dramatic moment of words said in anger, of a door slammed, of a relationship ending in a confrontation that at least had the dignity of being witnessed. It is the betrayal of ordinary omission, of things that were supposed to happen and didn't, of a presence that was supposed to be reliable and became instead theoretical. Kody Brown's failures with his adult children are visible. They exist in language. Paedon sat in front of cameras and articulated his grievances with specificity and heat. Leon has been public about their experience. There are words on the record. There are moments that can be time-stamped and replayed and argued about. And because those wounds exist in language, they are at least theoretically grievable. You can name a wound that has a name. Truly, Brown's wound does not have a name yet. It is made of silence and ordinary Tuesday afternoons. And a father who was somewhere else when she needed him to simply be somewhere near. And the reason this matters is not just another angle in the ongoing Sister Wives conversation, but something qualitatively different, is that unnamed wounds do not heal on their own. They go underground. They shape behavior from the inside, without the person who carries them fully understanding why. They show up later. In relationships, in patterns, in a recurring sense that love is something that eventually fades and disappears, and there is nothing you could have done to make it stay. That is the inheritance Truly Brown is being handed right now. Not dramatically, not in a single terrible moment, but quietly, consistently, in the accumulation of ordinary days where the math of her father's priorities keeps coming up the same. And now I want to talk about what the Sister Wives fandom has been sitting with for years, because the audience for this show is not casual. The people who have followed this family across 18 seasons are extraordinarily perceptive. They notice things. They track things. They remember things the show itself has moved past. And the collective intuition of this community about Truly Brown's story has been remarkably consistent. Truly's story is the one that will outlast everything else. Not Kody and Robin's relationship, which has been the show's central gravitational pull for the last several seasons. Not the adult children's estrangements, which have been the most dramatically documented content. Not Christine's departure, which was the moment that broke the dam on everything the show had been building toward. All of those stories are significant. All of them will be part of how Sister Wives is remembered, but the story that will still be talked about when the rest has faded, when Sister Wives is a cultural footnote referenced in think pieces about reality television and family structure and the long-term costs of documenting private life, is Truly Brown's. Because Truly's story is not finished. It is not even in its most important chapter yet. She is 13 years old. She is becoming the person who lived this story. And that person, Truly Brown, who will exist in 10 years, in 15, who will have had the time and the distance and the perspective to look back at her childhood and understand what she experienced, that person will have things to say. The fandom has been patient, and the evidence suggests that patience is about to matter. Because here's what I want you to understand about how Brown children have historically moved through this process. There is a timeline. It is not universal, but it is consistent enough to be meaningful. The Brown children who have spoken most clearly and most specifically about their experiences with Kody have done so in their late teens and early 20s, after they had enough distance from the daily reality of childhood to see the shape of what they had lived through. after they had enough language to name it, after they had enough of their own adult foundation to say difficult things without the ground giving way beneath them. Paedon was in his early 20s when his public candor became most pointed. The pattern holds across multiple siblings. Truly Brown is 13 now. The back of the envelope math on that timeline is not complicated. And I want to be careful here, because this is not about anticipating someone's pain as content. This is about something more important than that. It is about understanding that the choices being made right now by Kody, about how much effort he is willing to invest in crossing 600 miles and being present in his daughter's most formative years, are not private choices. They were made on a show. They were funded by a network. They were watched by millions of people across 18 seasons. The accountability for those choices is not something that disappears when the cameras eventually stop rolling. The receipts exist. All 18 seasons of them. And Truly Brown has access to every single frame. Which brings me to the prediction. The one that I think is both inevitable and quietly devastating. And I want to say it plainly because I think it needs to be said. Kody Brown will eventually, in an interview, in a confessional, in a public statement of some kind, describe his relationship with Truly as private and strong and not something he is willing to discuss in detail because it is sacred to him. He will use language like that, close to that. He has already deployed versions of that framing around other relationships where the gap between his self-perception and documented reality has become too wide to bridge through specific accountability. He will say it and he will mean it in the way people mean things they need to be true. In this way, a person constructs a version of a relationship in their own mind that is warmer and closer and more functional than the version that exists in the lived experience of the other person involved. And Truly, who will be old enough by then to have watched the footage, who will have had access to the documented record of what was prioritized during her most critical developmental years, who will have lived the gap between the private version of the relationship and the one that shows up when you count the visits and the calls and the ordinary Tuesday afternoons when he chose to be elsewhere, Truly will say nothing publicly in response. Her silence will be the most complete and devastating rebuttal that has ever existed in the SisterWives narrative. And Kody Brown will not understand why it feels like a goodbye. Because in his version of the story, he never left. In his version, he was always her father. In his version, the relationship is real and present, and does not require the kind of specific, documented, consistent effort that would have made it real and present in Truly's version. That gap between his version and hers is the space where Truly Brown's childhood actually happened. And I want to say something now that is not about drama or content or the ongoing cultural conversation around this family. I want to say something that is simply true. 13 is not too late. I need to be clear about that because everything I have laid out in this video could be read as a verdict, as a conclusion that the damage is done and the window has closed and the story is already written. And I do not believe that. The attachment research that identifies ages 7 to 14 as the most critical window for father-daughter relational development does not say that what happens after 14 is irrelevant. It says that what happens in that window is foundational. Foundational things can be built on. Foundational damage can be acknowledged and addressed and worked through with the right effort and the right honesty. 13 is not too late, but it is not early either. And the specific, irreplaceable quality of this particular window of being present for the ordinary days of a daughter's early adolescence, of being the father she can call when something confusing happens at school, of being the voice she hears when she needs to know that a man who is supposed to love her will actually show up. That quality cannot be retroactively manufactured. It can only be lived in real time, which means right now. Not in a confessional about it later, not in a statement about how the relationship is private and strong. Right now, in the crossing of 600 miles, in the booking of the flight, in the showing up to the ordinary Tuesday that nobody is filming, that will never make it into an episode, that exists only in the archive of a 13-year-old girl's memory of whether or not her father decided she was worth the effort. That is where Truly's story is being written right now, in the undocumented ordinary. And here is what I want to leave you with, because I have been sitting with this entire series for a long time now, and this particular story is the one that keeps me up at night more than any of the others. More than the adult estrangements with their documented confrontations and their clear timelines. More than the relationships that ended in language and were grieved on camera. more than the complicated marriages and the theological justifications and the logistical chaos of plural family life. This one keeps me up because it is still in progress. Because Truly Brown is not a cautionary tale about something that already happened. She is a real 13-year-old girl in the middle of her most formative years, and the choices being made about her right now by a father who has demonstrated, across a documented public record, a consistent pattern of prioritizing his own comfort and his own narrative over the specific, urgent, non-negotiable needs of his children. Those choices are not history. They are happening, and the SisterWives community, which has watched 18 seasons of this family, which has tracked every nuance and every shift, and every moment where the gap between the public presentation and the private reality became impossible to ignore, this community is the only audience that has the full context to understand what is actually at stake in Truly Brown's story, not as a drama, as a real child's real life. So here is the question I'm leaving you with, and I mean it as a genuine question, not a rhetorical device, not a content hook, but an actual question that I think deserves a real answer in the comments. Is it too late for Kody and Truly? Not as a drama question, not as a fandom debate question, as a real question based on what you know about attachment and childhood and developmental windows and the specific record of choices Kody Brown has made and continues to make. Based on what you have watched across 18 seasons, and whatever you know about how fathers and daughters find their way back to each other, or don't, do you believe there is a version of this story where Kody Brown becomes the father truly needed? Where does he do the specific, unglamorous, undocumented work of showing up consistently for the remaining years of her childhood? Where he crosses the 600 miles, not once for a camera, but repeatedly, quietly, because she is his daughter, and she is 13, and the window is still open, and some part of him understands what closing it permanently would actually cost? Or do you believe, based on the documented evidence of who Kody Brown has shown himself to be, when the gap between what is required and what is comfortable becomes too wide, that Truly Brown is already in the process of becoming the person who will one day say nothing in response to whatever he claims the relationship is? I genuinely want to know what you think, because this community thinks carefully about these things, and Truly Brown's story deserves to be thought about carefully by people who have been paying attention. Leave your honest answer in the comments. No judgment here. This is a space for real conversation about real stakes, and Truly Brown's story qualifies as both. If this video did what I hoped it would do, if it shifted something in how you understand the Brown family's most overlooked story, hit the like button. Not as an algorithm favor, as a signal that this kind of analysis matters to you, that you want more of it, that the SisterWives conversation deserves to go deeper than the surface drama that most channels stop at. Share this video with someone who still thinks Kody Brown is a misunderstood man doing his best in a complicated situation. Share it with someone who has never quite been able to articulate why the Truly angle feels different from the other Brown children's stories. Share it with someone who needs the language for what they have been sensing but couldn't name. And subscribe to SisterWives Crew if you are not already here, because Topic 18 is coming, and it is the video that connects everything. Every thread we have pulled across this entire series, every pattern we have traced, every gap between public narrative and documented reality, Topic 18 is where it all converges. And it starts with a single question that I promise you will not see coming before I finish the first sentence. Truly Brown did not get a goodbye. She got something harder, a disappearance slow enough that nobody officially named it, in a family public enough that all the evidence still exists, at an age young enough that the story is not finished. The least we can do is pay attention while it is still being written.